In the frozen heart of a Welsh winter, 1457, a child's scream tore through the stone walls of Pembroke Castle, silencing the howling Atlantic gales. At 13, Lady Margaret Beaufort, barely more than a child herself, endured a labour that should have killed her, birthing Henry Tudor, England's future king. It was no noble sacrifice, but a brutal transaction of flesh and blood, in a world that saw a girl's body as a vessel for power. Beneath flickering candles, her suffering forged a throne, at a cost no history book dares to fully recount. In the spring of 1443, a girl was born into a world already stained with blood, her cradle a chessboard where kings and queens wagered lives for power. Lady Margaret Beaufort, heiress of the Beaufort line, carried in her veins the tainted legacy of John of Gaunt, fourth son of Edward III. This royal blood was no blessing. It was a curse, a beacon for ambition and treachery in a realm teetering on the edge of chaos. Her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, bore the weight of this legacy until it crushed him. In 1444, barely a year after Margaret's birth, he was found dead in his chambers at Wimborne Minster, his eyes hollow from the shame of military failures in France. Was it a fever, as the court proclaimed, or a darker end, poison slipped into his wine, or a blade drawn by his own trembling hand? The whispers of murder followed Margaret like spectres, shaping a childhood haunted by suspicion and loss. By 6, Margaret was no longer a child, but a commodity, bartered in the ruthless market of noble alliances. Her mother, the cunning Margaret Beauchamp, known as the Dagger Duchess, betrothed her to John de la Pole, heir to the powerful Duke of Suffolk. It was a contract sealed in ink and ambition, binding two mighty houses in a dance of power. Yet, in the brutal chess game of 15th century England, pieces fell swiftly. In 1450, Suffolk's star plummeted. Accused of treason for his role in surrendering French territories, he was dragged from his ship, his head hacked off with 6 clumsy blows of a rusty sword. The betrothal crumbled, leaving young Margaret discarded, a pawn without a player. In the shadow of her father's mysterious death and her broken betrothal, she learned a bitter truth. Survival demanded sacrifice, and innocence was a luxury she could ill afford. Yet this was merely the prelude to a darker betrayal, one that would bind her body and soul to a fate unimaginable. In the candlelit halls of Bletsoe Castle, 1455, a 12-year-old girl stood trembling, as vows she scarcely understood bound her to a man twice her age. Margaret Beaufort, barely out of childhood, was wed to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, a Welsh warrior whose ambitions outweighed his tenderness. This was no union of hearts, but a cold transaction, forged to secure the favour of King Henry VI and tether the Beaufort blood to the precarious Tudor line. The wedding night was a violation cloaked in ceremony, a trauma etched into Margaret's soul within the very walls where she once played as a child. Her body, unready for the burdens of womanhood, was sacrificed on the altar of dynastic greed, her innocence shattered in a single brutal act. Within months, her worst fears were confirmed. Her young frame bore the weight of a child, a pregnancy that whispered death with every passing day. By autumn 1456, Edmund was dead, his life snuffed out in the fog of war, plague or treachery, no one could say. Margaret, widowed at 13, carried his child alone, her body straining under a burden it was never meant to bear. The journey to Pembroke Castle, where her brother-in-law Jasper offered refuge, was a torment of frozen mud and jolting pain, each step a gamble with death. In January 1457, the labour began. 18 hours of agony that tore screams from her throat until her voice was a broken whisper. Midwives, their faces grim, wielded knives and whispered prayers, knowing that neither mother nor child might survive. When Henry Tudor emerged, pale and barely breathing, it was a miracle stained with blood. Margaret's body was broken beyond repair, her womb forever barren at 13, a sacrifice to a throne not yet won. Yet from this wreckage, a spark of defiance flickered, hinting at a will that would defy the grave itself. In the blood-soaked spring of 1455, the first clash at St. Albans heralded a war that would rip England asunder, a brutal dance of roses, red for Lancaster, white for York. Margaret Beaufort, barely recovered from the torment of childbirth, stood at the heart of this maelstrom, her Lancastrian blood marking her as both prize and prey. The Wars of the Roses turned noble houses into slaughterhouses, where loyalty was a fleeting shadow and treachery a sharpened blade. Margaret at 14 was no bystander. Her son, Henry Tudor, was a living emblem of the Lancastrian cause, a child whose very existence invited assassins' daggers. Yet, in this chaos, she learned to weave survival from the threads of despair, her heart torn by the absence of her only child, raised in distant Welsh hills, under Jasper Tudor's watchful guard. To shield Henry and her Beaufort estates, Margaret entered a second marriage in 1458, binding herself to Henry Stafford, a Yorkist sympathizer whose loyalty was as malleable as wax. This was no romance but a grim bargain, a union to cloak her Lancastrian heart in Yorkist colours. She shared his bed while hiding her true allegiance, each whispered prayer in Pembroke's chapel, a plea for her son's safety. Henry, growing up a stranger to his mother, received only her coded letters, parchments laced with invisible ink, carrying a mother's love, wrapped in cryptic warnings. The agony of separation gnawed at Margaret, each day shadowed by dread. Was her son alive, or had Yorkist blades found him in the Welsh wilds? Her nights were haunted by visions of his death, yet she channeled this torment into cunning, cultivating alliances with women across both factions, their whispered confidences forming a web of secrets stronger than steel. As kings rose and fell, Henry VI deposed, Edward IV crowned, then Henry restored only to crumble again. Margaret honed her craft in the art of survival. She studied law, theology, and the dark currents of court politics, her library, a fortress of knowledge amassed with a scholar's zeal. Her intelligence, sharpened by loss, made her a player in a game where one false step meant ruin. By 1471, the Lancastrian cause lay in ruins at Tewkesbury, and Henry, now 14, became a beacon for desperate rebels. His flight to Brittany, a desperate escape from certain death, left Margaret shattered, her heart calcifying into something colder, more resolute. Yet, in this crucible of loss, a darker ambition stirred, one that would transform a grieving mother into a formidable architect of destiny. On a storm-lashed night in September 1471, a 14-year-old boy stood on Tenby's rain-soaked cliffs, boarding a ship that would carry him into 14 years of exile. Henry Tudor, Margaret Beaufort's only son, fled to Brittany, a fugitive from Yorkist blades that hungered for his blood. His mother, leagues away in England, learned of his escape only days later, her heart splintered by the vastness of the English Channel and the treachery of nations. Yet, from this abyss of loss, Margaret wove a tapestry of intrigue, transforming herself into a shadow queen of spies. Her network, a labyrinth of whispers and coded parchments, stretched from England's royal courts to Brittany's windswept shores. binding merchants, monks, and nobles in a web of secrets. Invisible ink and false names cloaked her desperate messages to Henry, each word a gamble against betrayal, each silence a torment of uncertainty. In 1472, Margaret sealed her third marriage to Thomas Stanley, a lord whose loyalty shifted like autumn leaves, a master of choosing the winning side at the 11th hour. This was no union of passion, but a calculated alliance, granting Margaret access to military might and political cunning. As Edward IV's reign faltered and Richard III seized the throne in 1483, murdering the young princes in the Tower, Margaret saw her chance. Richard's crown, stained with child's blood, crumbled Yorkist legitimacy, and Henry's distant claim gleamed like a beacon in the dark. From house arrest, imposed after a failed rebellion in 1483, Margaret orchestrated a conspiracy of breathtaking audacity. Through trusted servants and encrypted letters, she coordinated with exiles, bribed informants, and sowed dissent, her every move a dance on the edge of a traitor's scaffold. When Henry landed at Milford Haven in August 1485, Margaret's decades of scheming bore fruit. At Bosworth Field, Thomas Stanley's forces, poised to aid Richard III, turned traitor in a betrayal she had meticulously engineered. Richard fell in the Leicestershire mud, his crown claimed by Henry VII, the boy who had once been torn from his mother's broken body. Margaret, now the king's mother, stood as England's most powerful woman, her will forged in the crucible of suffering and sacrifice. Yet the triumph was bittersweet. The years of separation had made her son a stranger, their bond fractured by the very ambition that crowned him. As the Tudor dynasty rose, a shadow lingered over Margaret's victory, a reminder that power, even when won, exacts a price no throne can repay. Lady Margaret Beaufort's life was a tapestry woven with threads of agony, ambition, and unrelenting will, each stitch a testament to a woman who bent history to her design. From the screams of a child bride in a blood-soaked birthing chamber to the silent machinations of a spy queen, she carved a path through a world that sought to break her. Her son, Henry VII, crowned in the mud of Bosworth, founded the Tudor dynasty, uniting the warring roses through his marriage to Elizabeth of York. Yet, this triumph was no fairy tale. It was a Pyrrhic victory, purchased with her body, her motherhood, and her very soul. Margaret's love, twisted by political necessity, left her a stranger to her own son, their bond a casualty of the throne she secured. She died in 1509, days after her grandson, Henry VIII's coronation, her black marble tomb in Westminster Abbey, a silent monument to a life of sacrifice. Power, when forged in such pain, leaves scars that no crown can conceal. In the windswept stones of Pembroke Castle, her screams still echo, a haunting reminder of a girl who became a queen mother through unimaginable loss. For more tales of history's shadows, like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below.